Our next speaker, Linda McQuaig, has been a rare dissenting voice within the mainstream media. As a reporter for the Globe and Mail, she won a National Newspaper Award in 1989 for a series of articles that sparked a public inquiry and led to the imprisonment of political lobbyist Patty Starr. As a senior writer for Maclean's, McQuaig probed the early business dealings of Conrad Black, uncovering how Black used political connections to avoid prosecution. An irate Black suggested on CBC Radio that McQuaig should be horsewhipped. She challenged the economic and political orthodoxy as a columnist for the Toronto Star and as author of a number of national bestsellers, including Shooting a Hippo, Death by Deficit and Other Canadian Myths, and It's the Crude Dude, War, Big Oil, and the Right for the Planet. Her most recent book with Neil Brooks is The Trouble with Billionaires. So please join me tonight in welcoming Linda McQuaig.
Thank you. Well, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here tonight. I'm thrilled, first of all, to share a stage with such esteemed, impressive individuals who have made such a difference in showing us how to fight and stand up for what's right. This is just very exhilarating for me. Just say, I do feel a little bit bad. I mean, we've been lounging in these comfortable chairs, and I actually see there's some people still at the back. You know, there's a few chairs here at the front. I believe the front row was reserved for the Harper cabinet. But I guess it's safe to say they're probably not going to show up at this point. It's also a thrill to be discussing the sinking of the Harper government. That's a thrilling concept. I mean, I'm sure you share my disgust with the way the media likes to treat Harper as some kind of moderate. Moderate. I mean, the guy is clearly a conservative, and not just a conservative, but a neoconservative. A neoconservative, and by that I mean the kind of ruthless, nasty, poisonous version of conservatism that we've seen in the last 30 years. You know, in many ways, I think we got a wonderful insight into the nature of that neoconservatism not long ago with the revelation of that Mitt Romney video about the 47% and, you know, him saying it was not his job to be concerned about half the population. I mean, that was a wonderful thing when you think about it, because there was something, you know, they thought they were just talking to each other, right? The rich just talking to each other. But of course, it was captured on camera. And I think in that video, it became absolutely clear just the depths of cynicism, just the extent, the sheer extent of the greed, the sheer indifference to other human beings, to anyone outside their little circle. Completely different than the kinds of sharing and sense of responsibility for others that we've been referring to tonight. So that was quite exciting, really. I mean, it's interesting because, you know, there is or at least there was a different kind of conservatism. I think Bill was sort of referring to that a minute ago. I mean, it used to be that there was a kind of conservatism, you know, that it was elitist and it believed in inequality and all those things, but it also kind of had some notion of the public good. Some notion had responsibility to other members of society. I mean, we can think of Robert Stanfield, Joe Clark. I mean, there are Canadians that were in that tradition. But what we've seen with the rise of neoconservatism, this new conservatism, is something very, very different. I mean, essentially, they've retained the elitism, the extreme inequality. In fact, they've driven it up wildly, the level of inequality, and they've utterly discarded the notion of the common good. In fact, they're really quite contemptuous of the common good. I think John Kenneth Galbraith said it very well when he described the modern conservative as someone who's engaged in the search for a superior justification for selfishness. And so what we really have with modern conservatives or neoconservatives is a focus on nothing but their own self-interest, on nothing but enriching themselves. You know, and what they've been able to do as a result is carry out what you could describe as the biggest heist in modern times, in terms of just stealing from other people. In fact, what I really want to talk about, because it's something I've written about, is the enormous rise in inequality since we've seen this rise of neoconservatism. Basically, we've seen a massive transfer of income and wealth from ordinary Canadians, middle and lower income Canadians, to the people at the very top. And as was mentioned, I've actually written a book on this subject with tax professor Neil Brooks. And let me just quickly put that book in context. The book is called The Trouble with Billionaires. And there are a lot of books out actually now about billionaires and the new rich. But most of them are very flattering and you know, say the great things the rich have done. In fact, there's one new one out, I don't know if you've seen it, about this guy, John Paulson, the hedge fund manager, the guy who made $3.7 billion betting against the subprime mortgage market, and in the process helping to trigger the financial crash and all the ensuing calamities that's come from that. Well, now you would think anybody writing a book about this guy, this hedge fund manager, would think of some critical things to say. One or two. But in fact, you get a sense from the title of the book that the title of the book is The Greatest Trade Ever. Now that may be the view on Wall Street and maybe the view on Bay Street, but my guess is among ordinary Canadians, the views are more in line with the protesters who marched down Wall Street right after the crash, carrying placards that read, "Jump, you fuckers!" Anyway, I just want to say that our book fits into the "jump, you fuckers" genre of books about the new rich. You know, there's a tendency when you think about inequality and the rich to sort of assume that the rich will always get richer, right? I mean, it always sort of seems that way. But you know, the truth is, the interesting fact is that in Canada, we were making tremendous progress towards greater equality up until 1980. In fact, if you go back and look at the period between about 1940 and 1980, it's sometimes called the golden age of capitalism, or just the golden age, because yes, it was capitalist, but it was a capitalism in which there was tremendous economic growth, and that economic growth was widely shared among the public. In fact, average incomes were roughly doubling every generation. You know, it was, well, the growth was simply phenomenal and much more widely shared than we have today. And you know, I'm not talking about something imaginary. I'm talking about, well, I don't know, anybody in the room here born before 1980? See, we have one or two. This is a period, of course, that you lived in. And of course, what ended up happening, well, another thing back then, do you remember Do you remember the concept that growth was happening so fast that people thought, at this rate, in the future, what will we do with all our leisure time? Well, of course, we know what happened. After 1980, things changed dramatically. There was basically a counter-revolution by the rich, by the powerful interest to stop that move towards equality. We saw the introduction of a whole different set of policies. Often we could call them trickle-down economics, the idea of you give more money to the rich and they'll take it and invest it. This always seemed a little suspect to many of us. 30 years later, now we have the results. We can see conclusively that it was a fraud, that there absolutely was no trickle-down. In fact, in the past 30 years, all the income growth has gone to the top 10%, but particularly to the top 1% and to the top 0.1% or 0.01%. The higher up you go, the bigger the gains have been. We now have 61 billionaires in Canada. But meanwhile, among the rest of the public, things have been pretty slow, pretty stagnant or actually falling. In fact, the median income in Canada, once you factor out inflation, has not grown in 30 years. You know, and that whole notion that we were all, going to have all that more leisure time, well, what happened? It's gone, right? It's gone. In fact, we're all working twice as hard. In fact, basically the reason people are keeping up at all is because they're working twice as hard. There's the 200 family is the norm now. And now the Harper government, of course, just took away another 2 years of our leisure time by raising the pension age from 65 to 67. Now, you know, 30 years ago, the average CEO in Canada had an income that was roughly 25 times the average worker. And by the way, that's a pretty big difference, right? That's not like perfect equality or anything. But today, that gap is not 25 times, it's 250 times. And in some, like in the financial sector, it's way worse. That character I mentioned, that hedge fund manager, John Paulson, with the income of $3.7 billion, his income was not worth 25 times the average wage, or 250 times the average wage. It was actually worth 82,000 times the average wage. Now, how can this be justified? That means that he was working, that he was getting paid the same amount as 82,000 nurses, when you think about it.
The whole population of Nanaimo.
So, you know, it calls out for some kind of moral justification. I mean, by what moral standard, in what moral universe is a hedge fund manager worth 82,000 nurses? I mean, in what moral universe is that hedge fund manager worth one nurse? And of course, there's huge implications for society by this massive transfer of income and wealth to the top. Enormous implications in terms of our health, in terms of our social well-being. All the indicators that look at these kinds of things just find massive differences, you know, whether it's infant mortality, longevity, teenage pregnancy, whatever. Countries that have higher levels of inequality have higher levels of all these problems. But one area that I think maybe gets too little attention is the impact of this extreme inequality on democracy itself. Because one of the things we know is that economic power eventually translates into political power. And what we've seen with this huge concentration of wealth at the top is essentially we've become plutocracies here in North America. Countries, that is, that are dominated, effectively run by the very rich. You know, so you can see that, for instance, if you, you know, if you look at the impact that the rich have on things like economic policy or on tax policy, they essentially have a veto over those areas. But, you know, I want to actually point to another area that we think of less perhaps when we think of what the rich do, but is even more important, and that's the effective veto that they wield over incredibly vital issues like climate change. You know, when you think about it, as Bill has been talking about tonight, you know, you have a tiny, tiny little group, Exxon, a few other corporations, that amount to the most powerful, concentrated set of economic interests in the history of the world. And it's really that small group that is holding up actively blocking any kind of progress on climate change. You know, it's interesting because I think that you know, the problem of plutocracy, of domination by the rich, it's clearly always a problem. But it strikes me that it's a problem of far greater proportion than ever before, simply because of the way our capacity to destroy the earth has been growing exponentially. You know, and you can see that in the case of climate change. You know, in the past, you may have had ancient kings that were incredibly rich and powerful and used that to do terrible things. But now we have corporate kings that effectively can destroy the earth. So it's clearly the need to do something about this. You know, we've been talking tonight about the need to kind of fight back. I couldn't agree with this more, the need for fierce Canadians, as Bill put it. And you know, the truth is, there's another vision, of course, out there of how things can be done that's compelling and powerful and desirable. I mean, we don't need to make up examples of where this could happen. I mean, we can look at, for instance, the Scandinavian countries, see the incredible success that they've had. I mean, there they are, they're high tax countries, high spending, big government, all the things we're told that you can't do, that you'll have a disastrous economy if you do it. Their economies are extremely strong. In fact, the World Economic Forum always has them in the top 10 world countries in terms of economic competitiveness. Sweden, for instance, right now has no deficits. In fact, it's been running a surplus. We don't even hear about this kind of thing here, though. And of course, they have wonderful record when it comes to equality. They have wonderful programs, just fantastic health care, education, pensions, early childhood education, fantastic things, free university tuition. You know, when I was over in Sweden, I was so amazed by all this. I remember speaking to a government official over there and asking her, you know, you can't really have free university tuition, can you? And I remember she said, oh yes, oh yes. And then she sort of corrected herself and said, well, we make the students pay a small amount of their living expenses. You know, they have to pay for their beer money, that sort of thing. And then the one, of course, that always gets me is the 7 weeks paid vacation for every member of the workforce. Fantastic. So again, I was kind of questioning this with the woman in Sweden, and she said, oh, yes, absolutely, 7 weeks paid vacation, yes, definitely. And then, of course, you know, after a while, she started to hedge a bit, and I thought, oh, okay, now we get the real story. And she said, well, yes, it's not really 7 weeks, it's 9 weeks. And then she went on to explain, well, it's 7 weeks that they have to pay you at the beginning of the vacation, but then the employer is required to pay an extra 2 weeks as well. And I looked a little puzzled, and she said, well, otherwise, how would the people have enough money to enjoy their vacation? You know, which is a very good point. So clearly, what, is so amazing is that, what is the right offering? Austerity, cutbacks, doing without. And then over there in Sweden, they're offering this kind of paradise. We should be clobbering them on the left here. Instead, what do we got? We got 4 years of Harper. My argument, which is shared by everyone on this podium, is that we've got to start fighting back. We have been fighting back. We have to fight back more. We've heard lots of great examples of fighting back. I want to just add one quickly in this area that I've been talking about, and that is that not too long ago, you may have heard that Andrea Horwath, the NDP leader in Ontario, decided to demand that the Liberal government, in order to get her vote for the minority government, would have to pass a special higher tax rate for people earning over $500,000 a year. Doesn't seem unreasonable, really, when they were expecting everyone else to contribute through all kinds of cutbacks. And yet, when she proposed it, there was the absolute usual response: oh, you can't do that, that'll never work. And of course, the business community went nuts, and there was a guy that went on CTV, and a business guy then described it as ethnic cleansing of the rich. But here's the good thing. Here's where something very different happened, because for 30 years, essentially, our tax laws have been gutted. Our progressive tax system has been rolled back. It's been absolutely unbelievable, the extent of the gutting. And while this has been happening, progressive groups, progressive parties have kind of let it happen, not put up much resistance. But here's what happened differently this time. Andrea Horwath stuck her grounds, despite all this hoopla, and she won. She won. And it was incredible. In fact, when she just showed she wasn't backing down, almost immediately the other side folded, and it passed, and we haven't heard a peep about it since. It just sort of went through. And in fact, she just recently won another by-election. So, that's an example, I think, that's just a small toe in the water of what she did, of what needs to be done. But I think it's an example of what's possible. So I guess I just want to kind of conclude by making the point that we have to do a lot more of this. And I think we could start by actually demanding that the taxes on the rich be seriously raised. That would be a good beginning point. And let me just say unequivocally that as soon as you propose that, they will threaten to leave. I can guarantee you that. There'll be threats about how they will leave. But I can also tell you that, the studies show usually they don't actually leave, But I can tell you something even more important. If they do leave, it doesn't matter. No, I'm absolutely serious about this. The evidence shows that there is actually no advantage to a country to have a large number of rich people living in their midst. This is a myth perpetrated by the rich. So in fact, I think the proper response when they threaten to leave, when we're going to raise their taxes, is have a safe trip. Or actually, better still, let's take some inspiration from William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was, of course, the populist leader in the US in the 1890s. And in the 1890s, there was a push to bring in an income tax. They didn't have an income tax. And 400 of the richest businessmen signed a petition threatening to leave and take their fortunes with them if this income tax was introduced. And here's the way William Jennings Bryan responded to that in a wonderful speech he made to the US Congress in 1896. I'll just quote you a small bit of it. He said, "If some of our best people prefer to leave the country rather than pay an income tax, God pity the worst. We can better afford to lose them and their fortunes than risk the contaminating influence of their presence." He goes on to say, "Let them depart, and as they leave without regret the land of their birth, let them go with the poet's curse ringing in their ears." Thank you very much.